Welcome back to the Olivetti Personal Computer M280. Since last time, I've been having a bit of a play with this machine, just trying to get to grips with it. Been transferring some software onto the hard drive via the media of floppy disk. So one thing that I want to do at some point is install a network card. That will just make it a lot easier for us to transfer software to and from this, but also allow us to do a full backup of that 20 megabyte MFM hard drive. Because while this thing is running MS-DOS version 3.3, I do think we should update that a little bit. I would like to put DOS version 6.2 on this machine, just because it gives us better memory management features. But before we do any of that, before we do anything whatsoever, this keyboard, or more accurately, this keyboard cable, this needs to be replaced. I can just wave it here and bits are falling off it. It has well and truly disintegrated since last time you've seen it. There is bits of sticky rubber all over the place here. So I need to order a new cable. Last time when we took a look at this, just looking at the connector on the end of this cable, well, I thought it maybe needed a new 6-core cable. But before I go and order something, let's take the keyboard apart and figure out exactly what it is we need. Look at the state of this. There's bits of rubber everywhere. So how does our keyboard come apart? 3 screws along the front by the looks of it. One in there and one in there. And there's probably one hiding underneath this, and there is one underneath there as well, I assume. Yep. That's all the screws out. But it doesn't seem to want to come apart. They're just starting to come now. There must be clips in the side here. I just be very careful with the small screwdriver. There's one there about that position. There we go. And we're out. At least, if anything, doing this will allow me to clean the keyboard as well. And let's just see. I speculated before that these just feel like rubber domes. That is exactly what they are. Because this is just a membrane keyboard by the looks of it. Yeah, there's our membrane. The rubber domes are obviously sitting on top of that. But what about that cable? So as I say, I speculated that it's maybe 5 or 6 core. There's 5 pins out of this 9-pin D sub in use. The 6th might be for ground, you know, this stuff. And let's see what we have. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it is a 6-core cable. Let's just see if we can figure out what's going on here. So there's obviously a ground there onto the metal plate at the back of the keyboard. And there's no continuity from that through to any of this. I bet you that goes through to that there. It would help if the probe was in the right spot on the meter. Yeah, that makes sense. And okay, so that's a ground through to there. But none of the rest of them. Need to be careful with this because it's got those ribbon cables going to it. So we've got that ground trace there. Another thick trace coming up here. There's one coming this way with 2 of the wires made off onto that. And then we've got these 2 thinner ones here. So there's a capacitor there, which is connected between that point and that point. So I would hazard a guess that that is 5 volts there, since that's the positive side of the cap down there. But that would be the negative side, or the ground side of the cap, which would mean that that there is also a ground rail. So 2 of these wires coming through seem as if they are ground. In fact, 3 of the wires coming through are ground, because it's those 2 and then that one. That seems to be a chassis ground. We've got a 5 volt, and then we've got 2 signals. I would hazard a guess that that is your clock and your data. Well, you know, one of them's clock and one of them is data from your fairly typical AT style keyboard. And despite this having this 9-pin D sub, this is in essence just an AT keyboard. I suppose we could check that on the oscilloscope. Okay, so we have ground, we have 5 volt, we've got ground and ground, those 2 cores. That next one shows up as 5 volt, but if I say put my finger on the enter key, you can see that we have a signal there. I think that one is the clock, because if I just type random keys, it's always the same. Whereas the next one, if I type random keys, it sort of comes up slightly different every time. And I think that pin there is possibly the data. Obviously, with different key presses, it would be sending a slightly different signal across. So, in essence, all we have here is an AT keyboard. All we need is a 4-core cable, because we just need ground, +5, clock, and data. And despite the fact that you do have the 2 separate grounds here, and with the keyboard disconnected, you know, there's no continuity between this one, which seems to be like chassis ground, and then this one here, which is like your logic ground. With the keyboard connected to the computer, you can see that there is continuity between those 2. So 4-core cable is all we need. This cable, I would guess, is probably about 1.5 to 2 meters long. And on eBay, I have found this 2-meter coiled PS2 extension cable. Yes, that might have the wrong ports on the end of it, but we could cut those off, make off the new cable to that connector there, and maybe even be able to salvage the existing connector on the other end at the computer. So I estimated that's about 2 meters. That is one prime example of why you read the description and just don't look at the pretty pictures. This is a 2-meter cable before it is coiled. When it's coiled, it's barely even the length of the keyboard. So I think this is just a little bit too short. I do want to keep the coiled aesthetic though. And so what I've done is order this 5-meter serial cable. That will stop us having to muck about with trying to salvage that end. Yes, it would be nice to retain that, but it is a molded end on this end, and trying to salvage that would be rather difficult. So we can just use that end, cut this end off, make that onto this connector here, and we can have a go at trying to coil this ourselves. I've taken the cable out of the keyboard. There is more bits of it everywhere, and I've managed to figure out what each of these cores does, or well, what pin it connects to on this. This black, which literally just fell off that sheath when I touched it, well, that was the chassis ground. The orange cable then, that runs to pin 9. Red goes to pin 4. Brown is pin 3. White is pin 2. And the other black, that is pin 1. Now, I don't have another one of these connectors, but what I'll do is just cut this off back here, and then we can solder it onto the corresponding cores on this that run to the corresponding pins. So I'll do all that, and then we'll have a think about how we're going to achieve this look. No, not the disintegrating cable, but rather the coil. Well, we are almost there. I have all the cables made off onto this. I was able even to recover the original strain relief, so we do have that little bit of originality still in this new cable. But one thing I just want to check quickly. We do have these other 4 cores here out of this 9-pin D sub that's not going to be used. And I was half thinking of just cutting them off and leaving them floating. But then the thought occurred that, maybe I should make those off onto the ground. But just before I do that, I want to take a quick look on the motherboard, just to be sure that those 4 other pins are not connected to anything. I wouldn't want to be making them off the ground here, just on the off chance they are connected to something on the board. Maybe for another Olivetti peripheral that would connect to that same port, and I don't want to tie them to ground and potentially cause any problems. Isn't it just as well you check these things, because we do see this. So pins 1, 2, 3 and 4, they're all in use for the keyboard. Pin 5, that's one of the ones that will be floating now, and I was considering tying it to ground, but that is connected, and it's connected to that point there, and that is a plus 12 volt supply. So just as well I checked that and didn't plow ahead and connect that to ground, or we would have had all sorts of problems. So for these other 4 that are not in use then, I think all I can do is cut them off, bend them down, and I'll just put a bit of tape around that to make sure they can't come into contact with anything else, and that will leave them isolated. If I had been thinking, rather than using the PVC tape, what I should have done was put a nice big bit of heat shrink on this wire and just could have slid that up over all of this. But it's done now. I don't fancy cutting it all off again and starting again, so let's just leave well enough alone. The PVC tape will do. But before we start curling this cable, or coiling this cable, or springing this cable, or whatever it is you call this, I want to first of all test this. Okay, everything's hooked up. My only possible fear here is that the cores within this cable, well, they're a bit thinner than what was on the original. I also think that 5-meter cable, in total, I think that will work out to be slightly longer than what the original was. So there is potential for some volt drop here. I just hope the keyboard still works. Well, the LEDs came on. That's a good start. Let's see if it passes the keyboard test. Yep. Some of the keys aren't working. That's weird. This whole side of the keyboard's working, but this side isn't. And the caps lock key isn't working either. Nothing's working on this side of the keyboard. Now, I don't think that will be down to the cable. I wonder, with my manhandling of this, have I partly disconnected the ribbon? Well, the only thing that I could think of doing here was to reseat the 2 ribbon cables. Those ribbons themselves are sandwiched between the metal backplate and this plastic top. It actually looks as if it's all glued together. So if one of them has got damaged somehow, that is good night for this keyboard. But reseated them, so come on, that's all it needed. It's gonna work. So keyboard still passes. Is it gonna work? Oh, thank goodness it is working. You have no idea how much of a panic I was in there. First two rows work. Next row works. Yeah, we have one fully working keyboard again. So that's all it was then. Obviously, when I was moving this about, I must have pulled on one of those ribbons and disconnected it slightly. That is one serious sigh of relief. Okay, one last hurdle. Let's make this go curly. But not all of it. You can see there was a straight section here and a straight section here. So this first bit, that there is cut more or less where the strain relief was previously. So if we use that as a marker, that is roughly about the length of the straight section that we need. And what I'm going to try and do anyway is we need to wrap this around something to create the twist. And I'm going to try and use a bit of bamboo. Yes, you could probably use better things than this, but this bit of bamboo that I found lying in the garage is more or less exactly the same diameter as the original coil. So I'm hoping this will work out. Just going to pull that out of the way slightly, and then we can attach the cable to the bamboo using some more PVC tape. And then it's just a matter of wrapping this around this. But we want to try and keep a nice tight coil in it. This is going to be a bit of a pig to do. So let me try and coil it up, and then I'll show you the results. Right, that is us all coiled up. I did move the start point down past that big knuckle there on the bamboo. I did have to go over another one at this point, but it's not as extreme as it would have been there. So hopefully it won't be that noticeable after we get this done. So it's all coiled up, but to get it to stay like this, what we need to do is heat the cable. So for that, I'm going to use the heat gun. I've got it set to 400 degrees. We're going to heat this thing until it's nice and toasty, probably for about 10-15 minutes or so. Then we'll just leave it to cool, and hopefully that should be it. Does anybody know what the flash point of bamboo is? Right, I think that'll do. I've been heating it there for about 12 minutes or so. It is kind of hot. It feels like a sauna in here, absolutely roasting. So I'm going to leave that to cool now. In fact, it's getting a bit late, so what I'll do is I'll just leave this overnight to cool, and then we'll come back to it tomorrow, and hopefully we have one coiled cable. Well, it's looking pretty good so far. I've cut the PVC tape off the ends and it is holding its shape. We do need to get it off the bamboo though. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able just to slide it off. I sort of hoped we would, but it doesn't want to come there at certain points. So I think the only option I have really is to unravel it. Sort of like that. And certainly so far, that bit's looking good. I actually figured out if we hold the coil and just turn the bit of bamboo, it'll come out. And there we are. I am really pleased with that. That has worked out not too bad. Especially when you compare it to that mess. What's it like in terms of overall length? I did think the new one here would be slightly longer, but let's just see. So I tried to get those two bits about the same length, which they are. And the new one is actually shorter, but of course this has lost some of its springiness. You know, if we tighten all that up the way the new one is, I dare say they actually would wind up to be about the same length. So that is a success, and I can finally put this mess in the bin. So that is pretty much it then. Just need to reassemble the keyboard and we're done. I think that is looking pretty good. The new cable is a decent match for the case. I am really pleased with that. Give the keyboard a bit of a clean. Now, that has came up okay. There is a bit of yellowing on the white keys, but it is what it is. I think I'll just leave it. The new cable is through the original strain relief as well. And yeah, I think it's looking great. So just one last thing to do. Let's set up the PC again and make sure that this still works. So yes, keyboard is still working well and looking pretty good with that new coiled cable. Now the other thing that I had wanted to do in this video was to finish recapping that power supply, just to see if it would help sort out the voltages. If you remember in the last video, the 5 volt was sitting a bit high. We had to tweak the wee potentiometer a way down to get that 5 volt down to 5 volts, but in doing so it also pulled down the 12 volt. Well, I did order those capacitors now 9 days ago, and from a pretty major UK retailer of electrical components, but they've not arrived. So unfortunately this video is just about the keyboard. When those caps come, I will get them replaced in that power supply. But you've seen things like that a million times before, so I think all I'll do is maybe put a post on Twitter to explain that I've changed the capacitors and to see if it makes any difference to the voltage rails. So sorry that this video is very keyboard focused. Bit of a boring video, I suppose. But it is what it is. It needed done. I had to get that cable out of there. There is bits of sticky rubber all over the ground. I will have to vacuum out here to get rid of it all. But that is the end of that problem. Next time though, that we're going to look at this machine, I do promise you something a bit more interesting. I said I wanted to put some RAM in it. I'm going to put this in it. No spoilers, and I'm not sure if you can see it through the anti-static bag, but this is one big RAM card. So we'll take a look at this and get it set up in this machine, or well, try to anyway. But that's it for this video. So if you enjoyed what you've seen, despite the fact that it was just about a keyboard, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Why not hit subscribe if you haven't done so already? Still plenty more yet to come here on CRG, and I'll see you next time.